Have you ever thought of starting a business completely unlike anything that you've been doing up till now? Well, Jane Bertch did just that, and she started the amazing cooking school La Cuisine Paris after many years of working in the banking industry. Now, cooking schools and food was an industry that Jane had minimal experience in, plus it was in a country where it's not so easy for an American to be an entrepreneur. But Jane did it, and she created the amazing La Cuisine in Paris. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sharri Harmel. I'm your host for the Extraordinary Women podcast show, where we provide all kinds of ideas and insights and even inspiration for how women 50 plus can design and live a fabulous next chapter. Jane's memoir is titled The French Ingredient. I just recently finished it, and it is truly one of the best memoirs that I've read on the comparison of French versus U.S. culture. I interviewed Jane a few years ago for the Extraordinary Women magazine, so I already had this kind of high-level view of, her business life and the start of La Cuisine, but I had no knowledge of the details. And truly, the details are what makes this book so fun, so interesting, and incredibly inspiring. Jane, who is a gal from Chicago, starts out in the book by telling us how she ended up in Europe. She was in a banking position in the UK and within that organization found herself transferred to Paris. Her stories of what working in banking was like in Paris actually will give you great insight into how the work versus personal relationships in France, I'm falling apart here, are so different from what Americans might expect. The French truly are excellent. We don't think about this, but they truly are excellent at compartmentalizing relationships. Do they socialize with people from work? Something that's very common in the US? No. Will you know anything about your colleagues' personal lives? Like what they did on the weekend, where they went, where they're going on holiday, how their children are doing. Is anyone healthy or sick? No, you will not know any of that. Are there photos of their children or their partners in their offices? No, that's a big difference. Jane's descriptions of the formal rules and the required manners within her work environment explain how the French deal with relationships, and truly it might help you to better understand French social culture. For example, when I first got my apartment in Paris, I really liked the concierge. Now, concierge is a rather fancy word for someone who basically manages the building. They keep the hallways clean, they change light bulbs, they will call service people if something is wrong, significantly wrong within the larger complex as a whole. Now, I thought we might have a few more intimate conversations than just, thank you for cleaning the hallways. I love the work that you're doing. Oh my gosh, the courtyard is beautiful. I had those kinds of conversations with the building managers back in Boston. But here, that's not appropriate. There are rules for these kinds of interactions, whether it's your building manager, like I was just describing, or it's the sales clerk in a shop that you walk into, or even the manager of your favorite cafe. These people aren't being rude, but in French culture, it is inappropriate for you to pretend that you have a relationship with those people that is beyond a professional one. For me, this explains why many Americans who come to France, and specifically Paris, often think that the French are rude or closed off. The French just compartmentalize relationships. There's a degree of respect given to each person, regardless of what their position is in those relationships. And those relationships all have different sets of rules. different ways of appropriate communication. Maybe this explains how the French tolerated the years of Nazi occupation. Pretty big deal. I'm not sure how Americans, who are much more open and freer in their sharing of what might be considered intimate aspects of their lives, I don't know how we would have handled an enemy occupation that lasted a significant period of time. So, understanding the historical aspects of French culture, as well as kind of the cultural rules within the different compartments, if we want to call it that, of someone's lives. Jane also stated, and I thought this was just beautiful, in France, Jane said, friendship is not given, it is earned. It is a belief that comes through, according to Jane, and it's so true, even in the language. Vous, which is you, is a very formal way of saying you. And it's always associated with a level of respect. Tu, as an example, same word, is familiar and only used with close family and close friends. But even that isn't consistent. I recently had lunch with a really good friend here in Paris, lives in Paris. She's lived in France now for a long time. Her children are truly French and British. She shared that it's not uncommon to hear vous used with anyone older, even someone's parents or even grandparents. So there is an element of respect given to kind of the hierarchy of family, the hierarchy of social systems, if that makes any sense, that is so intricately a part, if I'm using that word correctly, a part of the French language. And those levels of formality and familiarity are very, very different for us Americans. And understanding that difference actually will help you to not only travel a little bit easier, understand those cafe interactions, but maybe better understand even international diplomacy a little bit. That statement of friendship is earned, I think, could be valuable for all of us. I don't know about you, but most of my most difficult relationships happened because I gave away my friendship rather than making the other person earn it. Interesting. Jane also shared that because the question really was, how in the world did Jane, who was a woman in banking, end up founding a cooking school in Paris? Well, Jane shared how during a weekend with friends at a country house, they got into a conversation about what would they want to do with their lives if there were no obstacles. I'm quoting Jane here, but what an incredible question. What would you want to do with your life if there were no obstacles? Well, Jane said she blurted out that she'd like to run a cooking school, and then went on to say this. I thought it was just so beautifully put. This idea started out as a tiny snowflake that gained force and became a snowball in the weeks that followed, until finally it was a full-on snow woman. Isn't that wonderful? Jane said, for the first time, and I'm quoting her here, I slowed myself down enough to imagine and visualize and seriously consider something that I told myself was absolutely absurd. This is what designing your fabulous next chapter is all about. Considering the absurd is actually what you will do in chapter 1 of my new book that's coming out in the fall. It's letting yourself not use those filters that say, oh, forget that. You're too old for that. That costs too much money. You don't have the skills for that. Go to the absurd. And I want you to think about Jane, this American woman, Midwestern American woman, ends up in the UK in the banking industry, then ends up in Paris and starts a cooking school. Now, Jane wasn't completely without skills for her cooking school idea. She has an excellent business mind, obviously. She also had worked in Paris for a while, so she was comfortable with the Paris business environment. She had taken some cooking classes and knew a fair number of people in the food world. It's hard. France, as an example, is very much a food culture, and therefore there's a whole lot of people who are excellent home cooks. They talk about food all the time. You go to restaurants and people, there's obviously lots and lots of options, but people have conversations about food. Actually, many of their phrases have to do with food, which are kind of interesting. Those funny phrases like never look a gift horse in the mouth. Well, they have phrases like that, but they always seem to have food in some way wrapped into that little phrase. It's very fun. Jane's idea of a cooking school was not a formal school for professional chefs, but it was a school that she wanted to be inviting and warm. And it was for the home cook that wanted to sharpen his or her skills, similar to Julia Child's cookbook and cooking classes. And I have to share, I have taken a number of classes at La Cuisine Paris over probably the last, almost 8 years. They are all wonderful. They're excellent. I took a sauces class, and I consider myself a reasonably good home cook, but I don't make many sauces up until that class, and yet I felt comfortable making all of the different kinds of sauces that I think make French dishes so spectacular. Now, Jane goes on in the book to share her various exploits in finding a location for the school. They had to move, and she talks about why. And she also talks about the state of the buildings that she rents for her school. One thing that most Americans probably would not know is that behind the beautiful facades that you see on the street are often buildings, because everything's old, buildings that are in great disrepair inside. And therefore, to start something like a cooking school would require a complete renovation. So it's really interesting. Jane also talks about how she bought the equipment, she hired staff, and kind of the difficulties of getting all the paperwork submitted to start the cooking school, which in France is no small feat. But she didn't give up, and neither will you in your next chapter dreams. Now, let's talk about those much needed relationships, because that's a very important part of Jane's book. She talks about how you really want to build relationships in the field or the industry that you want to be in. Jane connected with all sorts of people, from, cooking equipment suppliers, great chefs, friends who love to eat, friends who love to cook. Like I said, cooking is a part of French culture. All you have to do is read a French mystery, and they're cooking throughout the book. It's really quite fascinating. She talked to wine experts. She talked about, pairing wine pairings with food. Really, anyone and everyone who interfaced in the culinary world. Like I said, Jane wanted her school to be for home chefs, not unlike Julia Child. So she actually worked on building a relationship with the owners of the famous, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, de Iluran cooking supply store. It's an incredible store. If any of you are at all interested in cooking, you need to go visit this place, because it was founded in 1850 in an area of Paris that was once the center of a huge food market. The place, the location of De Iluran has not changed. But it's not no longer surrounded by the food markets that were there at one time. It's incredible. I mean, I've been there several times, and to walk through hallways that feel like they're or aisles, I should say, that feel like they're like this wide, and from the floor all the way up beyond your head are cooking supplies, things like there's a whole section on mixing bowls and another section on pots and pans and copper pots and oh my God, I can't, every kind of Madeline tray and muffin tray and popover tray. It's things I don't even know actually what they're for. I would have to ask. Just so you know, Julia Child was a close friend of the then head of the d'Ileron, which I believe might be the grandfather of the current head. It's a family-owned business, so it's just a wonderful place. But Jane goes into this whole conversation about how she actually felt like she made it. She was present. She was there when she developed a close relationship with the current owners of d'Ileron. So the point of that is that you want to take your idea and think about who you know in the industry that you are considering for your next chapter ideas. If you want to start a flower business, build relationships with people that are in that industry. And it doesn't have to be exactly what it is that you want to be doing, because you would be a direct competitor of that person, but all aspects, all the different levels within that industry. And remember, sometimes our connections are not linear. They're not obvious and maybe don't make all that much sense. For example, I recently went on one of Sharon Santoni's tours. Sharon runs the amazing My French Country Home. And this was a tour all about flowers, gardens, flowers, flower arranging, as well as brook hunting and all of that. And it was joined by Lucy Hunter, who's an amazing flower photographer, as well as a garden designer, and Sandra Sigmund, who owns La Fleur in Andover, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. Sandra has a business that's all around flowers, as well as a love of France. And at one point in the tour, I thought to myself, Sharri, what are you doing on this tour? I don't have a garden. I don't plan to start a garden. Actually, I have a black thumb, not a green thumb. I can't grow flowers. I don't know why. I don't like bugs. And I thought, good Lord, why are you here? But Lucy and Sandra and Sharon have all written books, and they talked a good bit about that book writing process and also the promotions that they're doing post the book. And that was incredibly helpful for me to hear, because as you all know, I'm in the process of writing a book that should be coming out in the fall. Plus, Sharon introduced us to some of the most creative people I have ever met in my life. And sometimes you might be able to relate to this. We just need our creative, pitchers or juices filled up within us again. Creativity isn't always here. It doesn't always go here. Sometimes it goes like this because of things happen in our lives. And I found that this tour, because of the people Sharon introduced us to, my creativity just expanded. And I thought, oh my gosh, what else could I be doing? Plus, the women on the tour, who were all primarily 50 plus or close to it, many of them were trying to figure out their own next chapters. So I had the perfect focus group, right? So that's what I mean by connections and relationships and reaching out to people who are in some kind of related industry, even if it doesn't look like it's a direct connection. And that gets back to the fact that not everyone on your connections list has to be or become a great friend. Think like the French. Some may become friends, but most are probably going to end up to be strategic business acquaintances that add to your next chapter design. Now, these suggestions apply even if you don't want to start a business. As Jane says in her book, and I thought this was so interesting, When the French make small talk, what they usually ask is not, what do you do for work? Which is what we ask in America. But they ask, what do you do in your life? A subtle but very different question, right? That is exactly why I did not title my book, Design Your Next Chapter Career, because it may not involve a career. I want you to design your next chapter life, which includes everything that you are passionate about, because our passions, right, are what makes us get excited for every single day. Last, we're going to talk about interpersonal exchanges, and Jane kind of highlights that throughout the book. I have to share that when I returned to the US after time spent in France, I'm a little put off because when I enter a store or a shop, I automatically look for the owner or the sales clerk and I greet them with a bonjour. And when I leave, I look for him again because I want to say au revoir or goodbye. You must do that in France, whether you're entering or leaving a cafe, a shop, the checkout clerk at the grocery store, a market vendor, you name it. It is considered the height of bad manners for you to not greet someone when you enter a particular environment and to, when you exit, to say au revoir, merci. Rather than thinking it's cumbersome, how about viewing it as being seen, which for whether it's you or me or the shopkeeper is something every human being wants. We want to be seen. Jane goes on to discuss the flirtation skills that are so much a part of the French and Italian culture. And she tells a story. I'm not going to repeat it here, but it's about an older woman's visit with a vendor on a busy Saturday morning. I have to share that honestly, I have been winked at, smiled at, complimented by more men and women in Paris in 1 week than I have ever been in America once I reached the age of 50. And I think that is why women especially love everything French. We even bring home things from our travels, right? To remind us of how visible we felt as women of a certain age when we were in France. That's my take on it anyways. I don't know what's happening to my scarf today. It's every which way. So my comment to you or my suggestion is why not bring some of those personal exchanges into our own culture, into our homes, into the way we interface with people throughout the day. Just a little example, email exchanges with a French person are very different than between Americans. Each email begins with a dear. So it would be Dear Mary, Dear Christophe, Dear Sharri, Dear Henri. You do not start with a hi or a hello or just their name, which you sometimes see, or even not any kind of an introduction at all. Going right to the point is very common in the United States, but it's very different. That connection is very different. And the emails always sign off with a name. I can't tell you how many emails I get that the person doesn't even put their name at the end. So something that actually, that kind introduction, that maybe connection at the first sentence that has nothing to do with the email actually does make you feel a little bit different. Just try it and see. Also, try saying hello and goodbye when you enter or leave a shop and see if it changes how you feel. There are just so many great insights in Jane's book that I think are relevant to whatever passions you want to pursue in your next chapter. Whether you want to start a little business or maybe get involved in an activity, a hobby, or join an organization or a cause that you love and feel very strongly about, I think there's some really good insights from Jane's book. Remember, the question truly is, What do you do in your next chapter life? What is it that you want to do in your next chapter? That's what's important. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. And if you enjoyed this video, please give me the thumbs up and do subscribe if you haven't already. I just absolutely love hearing from all of you. Take good care. A biento.